So welcome to our broadcast. My name is Reverend Alice Reid, and I want to say Happy Father's Day to all those fathers out there. This is also Happy Solstice. This is the summer solstice as well, June 21st. And this weekend we also honored Pride Month in many localities, as well as Juneteenth. What is Juneteenth? June 19th is the day that the last state in our union honored the Emancipation Declaration, a full 2 years after it was enacted by Abraham Lincoln. And it was Texas who was the state that was last to actually enact the proclamation. And when Texas did that, all slaves everywhere were freed. And it's a time of reflection, it's a time of celebration for many of our Black Americans. Today's topic is words matter. Silence gives power to the unspoken. And I'm speaking about words because when we look at this month-long topic of being a mindful maverick, what we know is that it's our thoughts, it's our words, it's our deeds, it's the way we do our spiritual practice. And so today we're going to focus on words, but from a little bit of a different perspective. And you might be wondering, as all the activity in our country is happening right now, as all the things that are going on around racism are happening, you might be wondering, some of you, many of you get it, but some of us might still be wondering, why is this still an issue? Why is this still up for us after all this time? I mean, the Declaration of Emancipation was fully enacted 155 years ago. And you would think that we would be through this by now, but racism seems to be dying this very slow death in our country. Dr. David Camp, who is a Black New Thought educator, travels around the country sharing some teaching that he does on a White Allies Toolkit. And he does these training programs, and he was featured in our Science of Mind magazine in February, and he was quoted as saying that 55% of white Americans are still what he refers to as racial skeptics. They believe that racism is no longer a significant problem in America. Well, I have a quote from Ernest Holmes that I want to share with you. The collective unconscious contains a record of all human events that have ever transpired. We are all more or less subject to this collective thought, and I would add feelings and beliefs and values, words and actions. Holmes goes on to say, the sum total of all erroneous human belief binds until the individual mentally lifts himself above the law of averages into the higher law of spiritual individualism. That's in our Science of Mind textbook. So when we look at this idea that racial skepticism is still at 55%, well, I'd say we're pretty close to the tipping point. We're pretty close to that place that Holmes is talking about, where we rise above the law of averages and we can begin to really heal racism at a deep level in our country. Lifting ourselves above the law of averages, we create this movement of mind that Martin Luther King referred to as the arc of justice. If you recall, it was Martin Luther King who said, "Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." There's great power in our words if we choose to use them. We're taught in this philosophy over and over again that our words are what create, that our thoughts are things, that we move from consciousness into form, into action, into our experience. But Holmes is pretty clear that the sum total of all erroneous human belief binds us. It binds us to error. It binds us to this belief in racism. Now, I don't believe that anybody listening to me today harbors hatred towards Black Americans. Not one of us. But I dare say that some of us might be complicit to this hatred. Complicit through our silence. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a movie or I've captured some piece of our history that was whitewashed and wasn't told to me as a white American, and I've wept and I've cried and it's broken my heart open. But then I really didn't do anything. There wasn't anything that I knew. I didn't know what to do when I hear about these atrocities that have taken place in our country over the last 250 years. I read recently that over a 400 period where slavery was still present in our country, worldwide, not just in our country, that over 12 million people were kidnapped, tortured, and terrorized to be slaves. That's an astounding figure. And I'm sure it gives you pause. And yet, what are we to do? And if you're like me, you probably didn't know what to do. After all, we're all good people, right? Isn't being a good person enough? I feel compelled to tell you a story of my youth and white privilege and the healing that has happened for me and is continuing to happen for me in my own story. When I was growing up, my mother was very adamant about making sure that we knew that there was injustice in our country. She had grown up with a best friend who, one day when they went to get a soda at the fountain, her best friend was told to leave the drugstore, and she didn't understand why. And that was her first introduction to racism in our country. I can remember in the early 70s when we were at a party, and there was a couple there. She was white and he was Black. And there were people who were really upset. They were very upset about this couple, and I didn't quite understand why. And my mother made a point of telling me that who these people were, there was nothing wrong with them, that the error lied in the other people at the party who were upset because these two people loved each other, and that it wasn't about their skin color, it was about the other people's bias. It was around that time that my mother informed us that we would be having a guest staying with us. And that is when Renee came into our lives, and we were part of a program called the Fresh Air Fund that brought inner city youth out into the suburbs. And when I was introduced to Renee, I could tell right away that she was very different from my family and my friends. I was about 11, and I had very little exposure to people of color at that time. I remember being awed by Renee. She was bright and brave and courageous, and I was a little intimidated by her. I was even a little jealous of her because she seemed to make friends very easily with my friends. She stayed with us for about 2 weeks, and we were getting ready to go on vacation. And she wanted to come with us. So we made the arrangements and got permission, and we were living in New York at the time in a suburb called Glen Cove, and we were traveling to Baltimore to visit my father's family. And so we brought Renee with us. We were only there a couple of days when tragedy struck. Renee drowned. There was an accident. It was horrific. Our family was absolutely grief-stricken and shocked. And I remember coming home immediately, and there was, the details were kind of sketchy. It was all so blurry and difficult. I remember my mother going to the funeral. I remember me not being allowed to go. I remember her saying how beautiful Renee looked in her white dress. But I want to say that after that incident happened, we never spoke of Renee again. Her name was never mentioned by anyone in our family after that time. There were no pictures of her in our family album. There were It was, if you were to ask me even 10 years ago about my childhood, that story would not have come to mind. And it's only been in the last 10 years that I've been able to bring up the trauma of that experience and to begin to speak Renee's name, to begin to reintroduce that horrible pain that was our family into my life again so that it could heal. And when I tell you this story, not to bring you along with my own trauma, but I tell you that story because it feels like it tracks with this idea of our national trauma. We, at one time in this country, we kidnapped and terrorized Black individuals so that they could do our labor, so that they could grow our crops, so that they could produce our textiles. And then when we had the presence of mind to free slaves in this country, to enact that proclamation of emancipation, it's almost as if we never wanted to speak of it again. And yet it lived underneath the surface in our country. And when I think about illness of any kind, and yes, I'm likening racism to illness, when I think of illness of any kind, if you don't treat it, the symptoms get louder. And so over the last 3 weeks, as we've seen people rising up to speak no to hatred and to speak no to racism, well, those are the individuals who are enough is enough. We are speaking truth to lies. We're speaking truth to this disease that has been under the surface in our country for way too long. There have been other atrocities on our planet. There have been other terrible things that humanity has done to humanity. But I really believe that in order for us to truly heal from them, that it isn't our silence that heals, but it is the power of our words. And so my invitation today is for us to begin to use our words, to begin to speak out, not to shame people, because if, in my example with my own family's experience with white privilege, we had great shame already about that experience. It was a horrible accident and we couldn't speak to it. Shaming us would not have healed it. But speaking to it, acknowledging the pain, taking it in so that one can heal from it, that's where we unleash that power to reveal love. And what I know about racism in our country is that the more we try to push it away and deny it, the more we hold ourselves back from what's on the other side of that. Because what's on the other side of healing racism in this country is a great love, is an open-hearted love where we can embrace each other fully. So instead of having this thing that we will not speak about, some of us can't even say the word racism. And it stands between us. It continues to separate us. I know that the fabric of our nation is good, that it was built on high and beautiful ideals. But there's still some part of us that hasn't acknowledged it. There's still some 55% of us still think that racism is not a problem in our country. I tell you my personal story as a way of freeing my family from a past that was incredibly painful. But it no longer has to live in the shadows. I've spoken it out loud, and I speak Renee's name. Every adult that was involved in that experience has passed. I don't even know Renee's last name. I know programs like the Fresh Air Fund and my mother, wanting to bring Renee out into the country, they mean well. But there's an underlying statement behind them. An underlying statement that if you can come out and be like us and live like us, then you'll be good enough. That's the underbelly of racism, where we have good intentions. But until I embrace, and I'll just talk about myself, until I embrace my Black sisters and brothers fully for who they are, for their culture, for the beauty that they bring into the world, until I embrace them fully, I still keep myself separate. And so our invitation this morning is to really look at how we can cross that divide, how we can open ourselves. And it is painful. It's painful to know that my ancestors were part of something as horrible as slavery. But we can't keep silent. We can't continue to propagate, pretend. Our history books are not accurate. They don't tell the story of our Black American citizens. And so it's up to us as white Americans to lean in, to find out, to get educated, to learn what it was like, to hold that pain so that we can truly love one another and we can erase the divide of separateness. Our philosophy works at the level of the individual. And as each individual reveals and heals whatever is ours to reveal and heal, it adds to that collective mind, that collective consciousness, and we raise up and we move into that tipping point so that we can begin to own our white supremacy, that we can begin to own our part in racism. Racism is not a Black problem. Racism is a white problem. In the August, we have an invitation to do a beautiful book study on me and white supremacy. It's offered by Centers for Spiritual Living, our global movement. There'll be ways that you can press in. I know that there's other action that we can take. I know that we can figure this out together. I know that this is worth our time. I know it's worth feeling the feelings. I know it's worth not being silent and using our words for power. I leave you with this statement from our spiritual leader, Edward Valune, and this will be our closing prayer. And after the prayer, we have a beautiful piece of music by Eddie Watkins. Edward writes, Centers for Spiritual Living stands with people all around the world who are advocating for justice, equity, inclusion, and peace. We are motivated by our vision of a world that works for everyone, and therefore we affirm with the people of the world that Black lives matter. Not only do Black lives matter, but according to our teaching, they are sacred. We have experienced a great movement in our country. There is a momentum of support from individuals along with spiritual and secular organizations as more than a fleeting moment, but rather the heralding of lasting change. We have confidence that a new era of willingness to engage in the inner work that leads to the end of racism in our world has begun. We have confidence that the unifying cry of our global heart, that Black Lives Matter, has struck a note of urgency in all who we hear it. And above all, we have confidence that the living Spirit Almighty is working through us to bring our stated belief in oneness into form in the social, political, judicial, spiritual, and economic realms, and importantly, in our hearts. The recent tragic loss of Black lives in the United States and other countries due to police violence and the myriad of inequities that have resurfaced have revealed that our world is still catching up to the vision of a world that works for everyone. We have been called to be the brave enough to examine how society can be out of step with its values and how we as individuals can be out of step with our spiritual values. One of the values of Centers for Spiritual Living is love and self-givingness, of the divine to all of its creation, expressing through us as compassion, caring, mutual respect, and kindness. Our organization's purpose is to awaken humanity to its spiritual magnificence. What can be more spiritually magnificent than to say a full-hearted yes to this upwelling of affirmation of the sacredness of Black lives? We invite you to stand with Centers for Spiritual Living and the people of the world by affirming with us that Black lives matter, so that we may demonstrate the values of our teaching and embrace the emerging universal consciousness of oneness. And he ends his statement with this quote from Ernest Holmes. Let us therefore light the candle of love, human kindness, forgiveness, and understanding in our soul, and let it shine brightly. Let us not peer into the darkness troubled and concerned because it is so foreboding and or unknown. Rather, let us remain steadfast in our radiance, that the spiritual light of truth within ourselves. Let us stand guard so that the winds of malice, cross purposes, ignorance, or misunderstanding will not blow out the light. Let us live each day, that the light from our candle of spiritual knowledge will forever be clear and understood, not only by ourselves, but by all with whom we have come in contact. And so it is.